love you, Thaddeus Cole.
I love you too.
The gelding had already refused the ramp 3 times by the time Thaddeus Cole rode up to the fence at Cross Timber Ranch, and the man holding the lead rope had run out of patience, the way men do when patience was never their strongest tool to begin with. Thaddeus sat his horse for a moment and watched. He didn't announce himself. He didn't offer advice unasked. He simply watched the gelding's ears, the way they kept swiveling back toward the dark gap beneath the wagon bed, and understood in about 4 seconds what the man with the rope had failed to understand in 20 minutes. "He's not balking at the ramp," Thaddeus said finally, swinging down from his own horse, a rangy bay gelding he called Providence, for reasons he'd never explained to anyone who asked. "He's balking at what he can't see under it." The man with the rope, a hired hand named Curtis, who worked the Cross Timber Gate crew, turned around with the look of someone who'd been told this by every stranger who ever rode through. "You want to try?" Thaddeus didn't answer that directly. He walked to the horse's shoulder, ran a hand down its neck, slow and unhurried, and then crouched to lay his hat over the shadowed gap beneath the ramp where the animal's eye kept catching something it didn't trust. The gelding's ears came forward. 2 minutes later, it walked up the ramp like it had never considered doing otherwise. Round Mountain, Texas, sat in the kind of country that didn't forgive carelessness. Limestone hills cut by cedar and live oak, a climate that had spent the first years of the decade teaching every rancher in Blanco County exactly how little margin they had. The drought of '83 and '84 had thinned herds across the hill country and thinned the patience of the men who owned them. Cross Timber Ranch had survived it. Not everyone had. It belonged to Ezekiel Odom, who had built it from 40 acres of scrub and rock, claimed under the Homestead Act, the year Thaddeus was born, and who now ran better than 600 head of cattle across land that stretched from Cedar Break to the low bluffs above the Pedernales. There were not many ranches of that size in the county owned outright by a black family, and everyone in Round Mountain knew exactly how many years and how much grief it had taken Ezekiel to build one. Belle Odom had been watching from the corral fence the whole time, close enough to see it, but far enough that Thaddeus hadn't noticed her until he straightened and turned. She didn't say anything about the horse. She only nodded once, the way a person nods when a fact has been confirmed rather than discovered, and went back to the mare she'd been working before the commotion started. "That's Miss Odom," Curtis said under his breath, coiling the lead rope. "She keeps the books here. Better than her daddy does, if you ask most of us, though nobody's fool enough to say that where Mr. Odom can hear it." Thaddeus didn't ask anything further. He'd learned a long time ago that a man who asked too many questions on his first day at a new outfit was a man who hadn't learned much of anything on the outfits before it. He was 27 years old, out of East Tennessee, by way of a tobacco farm. His family had lost to debt when he was 19. And he had been working other men's cattle in other men's counties for 8 years since. He owned Providence, a saddle he kept oiled past any reasonable necessity, a bedroll, and $11 folded into the lining of his boot. He had a letter of reference from an outfit in Uvalde County that a man named Sam Deering had written for him, without being asked twice, which was the closest thing to wealth Thaddeus had ever managed to accumulate. Ezekiel Odom hired him that same afternoon, standing at the corral fence with his arms crossed, and his eyes doing the kind of accounting a man does without meaning to. Sound hands, good horse, no debts he'd admit to. A letter that meant something from a rancher 2 counties over. $30 a month, a bunk in the line shack, and the cook fire in the mornings if he was up in time for it. "You'll answer to Amos," Ezekiel said. "He runs the crew. I run the ledger. Anything that touches money or land, it comes to me." Understood, Thaddeus said. Ezekiel studied him a moment longer than the hiring required. There was something in the young man's stillness that Ezekiel recognized without being able to name it right away. Not confidence exactly, and not the particular swagger young cowboys sometimes carried into a new outfit to cover for what they didn't have. It was closer to carefulness. The carefulness of a man who had learned that most things he wanted, he was not going to be given. Ezekiel had built cross timber out of exactly that kind of carefulness, 30 years compounded into 600 head of cattle and 4,000 acres of deeded land, and he did not trust it any less in a white cowboy with $11 in his boot than he trusted it in himself. He trusted it more, if he was honest. He simply did not yet know what it meant for his daughter. That evening, walking back toward the house with his ledger under his arm, Ezekiel passed the corral, where Belle was still working the mare, in the last blue light before full dark, and he saw Thaddeus standing at the rail nearby, not speaking, not offering advice, just watching the way she moved the animal through its paces, with an attention that had nothing performative in it at all. Ezekiel didn't think much of it. Not yet. It was, as far as he could tell that first evening, nothing more than one good hand recognizing another. He went inside and opened his ledger and made his entries for the day, and if there was a column in his mind already starting to hold a number he hadn't decided how to read, he didn't let himself look at it directly. Not yet. Belle found the fence 3 days later, out past the north tank, where the boundary between Cross Timber's grazing land and the county road ran along a stretch of caliche that never held a post the way it should. She hadn't gone looking for it. She'd ridden out on Juniper, her sorrel mare, to check on a heifer she suspected was close to calving early, and she'd noticed the new post before she noticed anything else. Cedar, freshly cut, set deeper than the others and braced with a rock collar, packed the way her father had taught the crew to do it 15 years ago, a method most of the younger hands had gotten lazy about. She knew whose work it was without needing to ask. Nobody else on the crew set a post that way anymore, except her father, and her father hadn't been out to the north tank in a month. She didn't mention it to Thaddeus. She wasn't in the habit of handing out praise to men who hadn't asked for it, and she'd learned, running the ranch's books since she was 17, that the men who did good work quietly and never mentioned it were worth more to an outfit than the ones who did adequate work and made sure everyone saw it. She simply wrote it down, not in the ledger her father kept, but in the small notebook she kept for herself, the one where she tracked things that mattered to her, and to nobody else. North fence, cedar brake line, fixed proper. Nobody asked him to. It was a small thing. She was aware it was a small thing, but she had grown up in a house where her father counted everything: cattle, acres, dollars, debts, and had never once, in 24 years, found a column for the kind of thing she'd just written down. She had started keeping her own book for exactly that reason. Ezekiel Odom's ledger was the most orderly document in Blanco County, according to the one banker in Round Mountain willing to say so out loud. He recorded every calf born and every calf lost, every dollar spent on wire, and every dollar earned at the railhead in San Antonio when the fall herd went to market. He reviewed it on the first of every month at the kitchen table by lamplight, running his finger down each column with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to every task he'd ever taken on, because thoroughness was the thing that had kept Cross Timber Ranch standing when so much else around it had gone under. He had built the ranch from a claim of 40 acres, staked the year he turned 28, 13 years after he'd walked off the plantation in Fayette County, a free man, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a tin cup he'd carried since he was a boy. He did not talk about those 13 years, and Belle had learned early not to ask. What she knew from Amos Judd, who had been with her father since before she was born, and who had told her, once, in the careful economy of a man who chose his words the way other men chose their bullets, that Ezekiel Odom had buried 2 brothers and a wife before he ever buried a single cow, and that everything he had built since was, in Amos's words, a man making sure it never happens to him twice. Belle understood the ledger, then, as something more than numbers. She understood it as the record of a man refusing to be surprised by loss ever again. What she had never been able to make her father understand was that she wanted, more than anything, to be trusted with the same responsibility, not sheltered from the risk of loss, but allowed to stand inside it and prove she could carry it. She thought about this on her ride back from the north fence, and she thought, without entirely meaning to, about the way Thaddeus Cole had crouched at that gelding's shoulder on his first afternoon and solved a problem 4 other men had been failing at for 20 minutes, without once raising his voice or his hand. At supper that evening, Amos mentioned, in passing, that the new hand had turned out steadier than most men were on their first week. Fixed the north line without being told to, Amos said. Noticed it was loose on his rounds, and just did it. Ezekiel looked up from his plate. That's so. That's so, Amos said, and returned to his food, offering nothing further, which was Amos's particular gift. Ezekiel said nothing more about it that night, but he made a note in his own mind, the kind that didn't go in any ledger, a hand who fixed what he found broken, without waiting to be asked, was a rare enough thing that it deserved remembering. He did not yet connect it to his daughter. He was, in this one particular blind spot, slower than most men in Round Mountain to notice what was forming in his own corral, because he had spent so many years training himself to watch for threats to the land that he had never quite learned to watch for the ones that might come, gently and without any warning at all, for his daughter's heart. Amos paired them without much thought behind it. Thaddeus knew the ground least, Belle knew it best, and there were 40 head of strays reportedly working their way into the brush country, west of the home pasture, where the cedar grew thick enough to swallow cattle whole for a week at a time. It was slow work by design. One rider pushed from the low ground, while the other worked the ridgeline above, and the 2 of them called back and forth across the brush, in short, practical sentences that had nothing to do with conversation, and everything to do with not losing 3 cows in country that didn't forgive carelessness. It took most of a day, and somewhere in the middle of it, without either of them deciding to let it happen, the short, practical sentences began to stretch into longer ones. "Where'd you learn to read a horse like that?" Belle asked, when they'd stopped to let their mounts blow at the base of a limestone shelf, the cattle bunched and settling below them. The one that wouldn't load. "Same place you learned it, I expect," Thaddeus said, watching, and getting it wrong enough times to start getting it right. "I didn't ask if you learned it the same place. I asked where." He almost smiled at that, the way she'd caught the difference, and pushed past his deflection, without making a show of it. "Tennessee, mostly. My father kept mules more than horses. Difference in temperament, but the watching's the same." "What happened to the farm?" It wasn't a question most men asked directly, and it wasn't a question he answered directly either, most of the time. "Debt," he said. "A bad year that turned into 3 bad years, and a bank that wasn't interested in waiting on the 4th. Belle didn't offer sympathy, which he noted and appreciated. She simply nodded, the way she'd nodded at the gelding on his first day, an acknowledgement rather than a performance. "I've been reading up on land titles," she said, after a while, apropos of nothing except that the conversation had opened a door she didn't often walk through with anyone. "County filings, how deeds get challenged, how they get held. My father's never lost an acre of this ranch, not since the claim went through, but I've read enough case reports out of Austin to know how thin that kind of good fortune can run for a family like ours. I wanted to understand it better than he does, if I could. Not to argue with him, just so somebody in this house understands the whole shape of the risk. Most people, Thaddeus said, wouldn't spend their evenings reading county filings for a ranch they don't run. I run the books, she said. That's not nothing. I didn't say it was nothing. I said most people wouldn't do the reading you're doing on top of it. He looked at her directly then, not the glancing kind of look men gave her when they were deciding what to say next, but a plain, unhurried look that took her seriously without making a display of taking her seriously. Most people stop asking questions once they've got an answer that's good enough to get by on. You're not doing that. She felt something in that observation land, somewhere she hadn't expected. Most people, she said, echoing him without quite meaning to. Stop listening after the first sentence when I start explaining any of it. I'm not most people. No, she said, and there was something almost like a laugh in it, quiet and real. I'm starting to see that. They rode on. The cattle moved ahead of them, unbothered, down through the cedar toward the home pasture, and the afternoon light came in low and gold through the brush the way it did in October in that country, turning even the rocks the color of something worth keeping. Neither of them said anything else that mattered, in the strictest sense of the word. But something had shifted in the space between them, the way ground shifts after a rain nobody saw coming, and both of them understood it, and neither of them named it, because naming it felt, for the moment, like more than either of them was ready to spend. Amos found them coming in at dusk, the strays bunched tight and moving easy, and he looked at the two of them for a moment, with the particular expression of a man who had spent 30 years reading cattle and had learned, along the way, to read people almost as well. Good work today, he said, and left it there, because Amos Judd had never in his life said more than a situation required. The last Saturday of October, Bell rode into Round Mountain for flour, coffee, and a spool of wire the North Pasture crew had run short on, and because his errands overlapped with hers that morning, Thaddeus rode in alongside her. It wasn't an arrangement either of them had discussed. It was simply the sort of thing that had started happening without either of them naming it. Two people whose paths crossed often enough on a working ranch that riding into town together had stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a habit. Prager's Mercantile sat at the corner of the town square, its shelves stocked with the ordinary business of a hill country settlement. Dry goods, tools, bolts of calico, a scale for weighing coffee beans that Ottilie Prager kept polished to a shine that seemed to matter more to her than most things in the store. Ottilie had run the Mercantile since her husband's death 6 years back, and she ran it well, and she also ran, without ever seeming to notice she was doing it, a fairly complete accounting of who came into town with whom. Miss Odom, she said, setting the flour on the counter, her eyes moving once, briefly, to Thaddeus, waiting by the door, with a coil of wire over his shoulder. That's your father's new hand, I take it. It is, Belle said, counting out her coins. He rides in with you often? When our errands line up. Belle's voice carried the same even courtesy it always did, the courtesy that gave nothing away and asked for nothing in return. Same as I'd ride in with Amos, or with any of the crew, if the errands lined up for them instead. Ottilie didn't say anything further, but the look she gave the flour sack as she slid it across the counter carried its own kind of commentary, the sort of look that didn't require words to make its meaning understood. It was the same look, more or less, that had followed Belle through town for 2 weeks now, ever since someone had first noticed how often the new white hand from Cross Timber seemed to find reasons to be standing near the Odom wagon. Belle had decided, the first time she felt that look land on her, that she was not going to spend her life rearranging herself around other people's discomfort. It was a decision that had cost her something to make, and it cost her something small again every time she had to make it over. Outside, Thaddeus had heard enough of the exchange through the open door to understand its shape without needing the particulars explained to him. He said nothing about it as he loaded the flour and the wire into the wagon, and he said nothing about it on the ride toward Bethel Creek, where the Odom family and most of the Cross Timber crew were headed for the church social that followed the Sunday service, a gathering that had nothing to do with Ottilie Prager's mercantile, and everything to do with the community Belle had grown up inside, warm and unhurried, and entirely her own. It was there, standing near the trestle tables where the women of the congregation had laid out the afternoon's dinner, that Reverend Micah Sparrow, a broad, unhurried man who had baptized Belle in Bethel Creek itself 22 years before, came to stand beside Thaddeus with a plate of cornbread in each hand, offering one without comment. "You're the new man out at Cross Timber," Sparrow said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Ezekiel Odom doesn't hire careless men." Sparrow looked out over the gathering, at Belle laughing at something one of the older women had said, her whole face open in a way it rarely was in front of strangers. "And he doesn't raise careless daughters either, whatever this is you're carrying." He didn't elaborate on what this meant, and didn't need to. "You'd do well to carry it as carefully as you carry everything else people tell me you carry." "I intend to," Thaddeus said. Sparrow studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, satisfied for the time being, and moved on to greet the next family arriving from the road. It was not approval exactly. It was something closer to a marker being set, a reminder that whatever Thaddeus was building with Belle, he was building it inside a community that had already survived a great deal to stand where it stood, and that community would be watching to see whether he understood the weight of that or not. Belle found him a few minutes later, near the edge of the gathering, and handed him a second plate without being asked, the kind of small gesture that meant more than either of them said out loud. "Ottilie Prager's opinion of my errands," she said, "is not going to change how I run them." "I wasn't expecting it to," Thaddeus said. "Good," she said, and there was something steady and certain in the word that had nothing to do with the town at all, and everything to do with the two of them standing there together in the low afternoon light, unbothered, exactly where they meant to be. There was a shelf in the kitchen at Cross Timber, just above the window that looked out over the horse pens, where Ezekiel Odom kept exactly 3 things: his mother's Bible, a small tintype photograph so faded it had become more suggestion than image, and a battered tin cup with a dent in its rim that had never once, in the 24 years of Belle's life, been used to hold anything at all. She had asked about it once, when she was 9, and her father had told her only that it was old and that it mattered to him, and something in the way he said it had taught her, even at 9, not to ask again. She had grown up understanding it as one of the few things about her father that existed entirely outside the ledger, outside the careful accounting he brought to everything else in his life, a private country he had never once invited her into. What Belle did not know, because Ezekiel had never told her, was that the cup had come with him the day he walked off the Fayette County plantation where he'd been born, 13 years before he staked the claim that became Cross Timber. He had been offered, on that last night, a choice by the overseer who ran the place in the owner's long absences, a choice that had nothing to do with cattle or money, but everything to do with the same shape of bargain Ezekiel would one day offer Thaddeus Cole without fully understanding why he was reaching for that particular tool. "Stay quiet about what you saw that night," the overseer had told him, "and there'll be an easier road out of here than the one you're planning. Say one word of it, and there won't be a road out at all." Ezekiel had chosen wrong, once, a long time ago, in a moment he had never described to another living soul. A silence he had kept, out of fear, that had cost another man dearly, a debt Ezekiel had spent the following 30 years trying, in ways large and small, to repay to nobody in particular, and everybody at once. The cup was the last thing he'd carried out of that place, the night he finally chose right, months later. And every ranch he built, and every ledger he kept afterward was, in some way, he had never said aloud, an argument he was making to himself, that a man could recover from choosing wrong, if he was willing to spend the rest of his life proving it. He thought about the cup more than usual that week, without entirely knowing why, until he admitted to himself late one evening, reviewing his ledger by lamplight, that he was thinking about it because he recognized something of his younger self in the quiet, careful cowboy his daughter had started finding reasons to stand near. Not the poverty, the carefulness, the particular stillness of a man who had learned not to expect much and had decided, somewhere along the way, to be worth trusting regardless. It unsettled him more than it comforted him. A man who saw too much of himself in another man's face had a harder time deciding what that man deserved. That same night, out past the home pasture where a portion of the herd was bedded for calving watch, Belle and Thaddeus sat their horses side by side in the dark, taking a turn at the watch that Amos usually handled alone. The sky over the hill country in late October ran clear and enormous. More stars than either of them could name, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, content in the particular ease that comes from two people who have stopped needing to fill silence. "My father keeps a cup on the kitchen shelf," Belle said eventually. "Never uses it, never explains it. I think it's the only thing in that house he owns that isn't in his ledger." "Everybody's got one of those," Thaddeus said. "A thing that doesn't fit anywhere, so you just keep it." "What's yours?" He was quiet for a moment, turning the question over. "My father's pocket knife," he said finally. "Dull as a spoon, never sharpened it once since he gave it to me. I couldn't tell you why I've carried it 8 years, instead of just buying a better one. Maybe because it's not really about the knife." "No," he said. "I don't expect it is." The herd shifted below them, settling, and somewhere off toward the tree line, a horse nickered low and went quiet again. Belle didn't say anything else for a while, and neither did he, and the not saying, out there under all that sky, felt like its own kind of conversation, the kind that didn't need words to carry its full weight, the kind two people only arrive at once they've stopped performing for each other and started simply being present, side by side, in the same wide, quiet dark. The mare went into labor 3 weeks before anyone expected her to, in the cold hour just past midnight, and it was Thaddeus who heard her distress first from the line shack and came running across the yard in his shirt sleeves, with a lantern swinging wild in his hand. Belle was there within minutes, pulling a coat over her nightclothes, because the mare, a gray named Delphine that Belle had raised from a weanling herself, was one of the few animals on the ranch she considered, without ever saying so out loud, to be entirely her own responsibility. The foal came early and came wrong, one leg folded back where it should have been extended, and for the better part of an hour, it was Thaddeus's hands and Belle's knowledge working together in the lantern light, her calling instructions in a voice gone tight and low, with fear she wasn't bothering to hide, him following them without hesitation, and without once suggesting he knew better than she did. "Reach in past the shoulder," she said. "Find the leg. It's folded, not stuck. You should be able to bring it forward, if you're patient with it." He did as she said, his arm into the shoulder, his face set with the particular concentration of a man doing something difficult and refusing to let fear make him clumsy about it. Got it, he said, after a long moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Bringing it now. The foal came a few minutes later, small and wet and impossibly thin-legged, and for a terrible stretch of seconds it didn't move at all, and Belle knelt in the straw and cleared its nose and rubbed hard along its ribs the way she'd been taught, and Thaddeus knelt beside her doing the same on the other side without being told, and between the two of them, working in a silence too urgent for words, the foal finally coughed and drew a breath and began, weakly, to struggle toward standing. "There," Belle said, and her voice broke slightly on the single word, relief arriving all at once, after fear had been holding it back. "There you are." They stayed with the mare and the foal until well past 2 in the morning, mixing a warm mash, checking the foal's breathing at intervals, keeping the lantern trimmed low so as not to startle either animal. At some point in that long stretch of quiet vigilance, sitting side by side on an overturned feed bucket with their shoulders nearly touching, Belle noticed a shallow cut along the back of Thaddeus's forearm, torn open sometime during the delivery and bleeding slow and mostly unnoticed beneath his rolled sleeve. "You're bleeding," she said. He glanced at it as though it belonged to someone else, didn't feel it happen. She didn't ask permission before she took his arm and turned it toward the lantern light, examining the cut with the same brisk competence she brought to everything else that needed tending. She tore a strip from the hem of her petticoat without hesitation, a practical solution to a practical problem, and bound the cut clean and tight, her fingers steady even though her hands had been shaking, faintly, only minutes before, with the fear of losing the foal. "You didn't have to reach in like that," she said, not looking up from the binding. "Could have sent for Amos." Amos was 2 miles off at the north camp. Foal didn't have 2 miles to spare. "No," she agreed. "It didn't." She finished the binding and did not immediately let go of his arm, and for a moment neither of them moved, the lantern throwing its small, warm circle of light around them, while the mare nosed at her foal in the straw a few feet away, both animals alive because 2 people had refused to hesitate when hesitation would have cost something neither of them was willing to spend. "Thank you," she said finally, quiet, meaning it in a way that reached past the foal entirely. "Wasn't just me," he said. "Wouldn't have known what to do with that leg if you hadn't told me. Wouldn't have mattered what I told you if you hadn't been willing to do it." They sat like that a while longer, her hand still resting lightly at his wrist, neither of them in any particular hurry to end the moment, until the foal finally gained its feet on its second attempt and stood there swaying, impossibly new, and both of them laughed, quiet and unguarded, at the small, ordinary miracle of it, a sound that had nothing performed about it at all, the kind of laugh that only comes when 2 people have stopped watching themselves and started simply living inside a moment they didn't expect to share. Percy Langford rode in from Elm Hollow Ranch on the first Saturday of November, as he did most months, with a leather-bound book of poetry from an Austin bookseller tucked carefully into his saddlebag, and the easy, practiced manners of a man who had never once in his life had to wonder whether he'd be welcome somewhere. He was, by any honest measure, a good man. His family's ranch in the next county over ran nearly as many cattle as Cross Timber did, built by his grandfather in the years just after emancipation, and expanded steadily since, through the kind of careful, unspectacular management that Ezekiel Odom respected more than almost anything else in the world. Percy was 29, well-spoken, generous with his time and his money, and had made his intentions toward Belle known to her father, with a directness that Ezekiel found, if not exciting, at least entirely reassuring. "For you," Percy said, presenting the book to Belle on the porch, where Ezekiel had settled into his usual chair with the particular contentment of a man watching a suit he approved of proceed exactly as he hoped it would. Longfellow. The bookseller said it was popular this season. That's kind of you, Belle said, and meant it, because it was kind, and because Percy Langford had never once been unkind to her in the 4 years she'd known him. She read a few pages that evening on the porch, out of courtesy more than interest, and found the verses pleasant enough, in the way that pleasant things often are, agreeable, well-made, entirely forgettable by morning, she thought, turning the pages, of the saddle Thaddeus kept oiled past any reasonable necessity, and could not have explained to anyone, least of all herself, why the comparison arrived unbidden, or why it lingered. It was 2 days later that she found her old saddle, the one she'd ridden as a girl, retired to a peg in the tack room for want of any real use, freshly restitched along a seam that had been fraying for over a year, the leather conditioned and supple again, in a way it hadn't been since she was 17. Nobody had mentioned doing it, nobody claimed the work, but she knew, the same way she'd known about the fence at the North Tank, exactly whose hands had done it, and exactly why he hadn't said a word about it to anyone, least of all her. She stood in the tack room a long while, running her thumb along the new stitching, and admitted to herself, in the particular privacy a person allows themselves only when no one else is present to hear the admission, that she did not want Percy Langford to come back next month. She did not want his poetry, however kindly meant. She wanted a mended saddle nobody took credit for, and a man who noticed a torn ledger corner before she did, and evenings under an enormous hill country sky, where the not talking said more than any book of verses ever could. It was not a decision she made lightly, and it was not one she said aloud to anyone, not even to Thaddeus. But she carried it with her differently after that, the way a person carries a fact they've finally stopped arguing with themselves about. Ezekiel, watching Percy's visit conclude from the porch that evening, remained entirely satisfied with the shape of things as he understood them. Percy had stayed for supper, had spoken with easy confidence about herd management and the price cattle were fetching at the San Antonio stockyards, and had ridden off toward Elm Hollow with the same unhurried assurance he arrived with. A man, in Ezekiel's accounting, who represented every column balancing exactly as it should. What Ezekiel did not see, because he had not yet trained himself to look for it, was his daughter standing at the tack room door, an hour later, in the last of the daylight, her hand still resting against the newly mended leather, her face turned toward the horse pens where Thaddeus was finishing the evening feed alone, moving through the ordinary business of his work, with the same unhurried care he brought to everything, entirely unaware that he had, without meaning to, already won something he hadn't known he was competing for. She did not go to him that evening. She simply watched him a while longer than she needed to, and then went inside to sit with her father over the ledger. Her mother, 8 years gone now, quieter than usual that evening, carrying something new and unspoken that would take several more weeks and one difficult morning at the corral fence to finally come fully into the light. Ezekiel came out to the corral before first light on a Tuesday in mid-November, while the frost was still thick enough on the rails to whiten his gloves where he gripped them, and found Thaddeus already there, saddling Providence for the morning's work with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. He set 2 things on the top rail. The first was an envelope, thick with folded bills, $400 he had counted out the night before, at the kitchen table. With the same careful attention, he gave every entry in his ledger. The second was the tin cup from the kitchen shelf, which he had taken down that morning for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, and which he set beside the money without explanation. "I want you to understand," Ezekiel said, "that this isn't a threat. I've built a habit, most of my life, of giving a man a fair choice before I give him a hard word. You've earned that much from me, whatever else comes of this morning." Thaddeus looked at the envelope, and then at the cup, and then at Ezekiel. "What's the choice?" "The money is yours if you ride out this week. Full season's wages, more than fair, and a letter from me that'll open doors at any outfit between here and Fort Worth. You take that. There's no hard feeling between us, and my daughter goes on with her life the way I've always meant for her to." "And the cup?" "The cup," Ezekiel said, "you don't get to have yet. That's not part of the offer. That's just something I wanted you looking at while you decide." The frost was starting to lift off the rails in the first thin light, and somewhere behind them a horse shifted in its stall, and Thaddeus stood there a long moment, not reaching for either thing on the rail, working something through in his mind with the same careful attention he gave to a spooked animal. "I'll have your answer tonight," he said finally. "I'll have it now," Ezekiel said. "A man who needs the day to think on $400 has already made up his mind. I'd rather hear the honest version than the considered one." Thaddeus was quiet a moment longer, and when he spoke slowly, choosing each word with the deliberateness of a man laying fence posts he intended to still be standing in 20 years. "Then here's the honest version," he said. "I'm not taking your money, and I'm not riding out. I mean to keep working this ranch as long as you'll have me on terms I can live with, and I mean to court your daughter, if she'll allow it, and I mean to do both of those things, without a dollar of yours changing hands over it. You understand what you're asking her to risk. What I built here, I built so she'd never have to start with nothing, the way I did. A man with $11 in his boot can't promise her that." "No," Thaddeus said. "I can't promise her land, or money, or the kind of safety you've spent 30 years building. I know exactly what I don't have, Mr. Odom. I've known it every day since I was 19 years old. What I can promise her is that I'll never once ask her to be less than she is, to make me more comfortable with what I'm not." Ezekiel looked at him a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that he did not let reach his face. He did not pick up the envelope. He did not pick up the cup. He stood there at the rail in the lifting frost for what felt, to both of them, considerably longer than it was, and then he turned without another word and walked back toward the house, leaving both things sitting on the rail behind him, the money and the cup, side by side, neither claimed, neither refused outright, an account left open that neither man yet knew how to close. Ezekiel spent the better part of 3 days turning the corral conversation over in his mind, the way he turned over a column of figures that refused to balance, not angrily, but persistently, the way an unresolved sum stays at the edge of a man's attention, no matter how many times he sets the ledger aside. He knew what he knew about Thaddeus Cole on paper. Sound with horses, thorough with cattle, no complaints from the crew, a letter of reference from a rancher whose word carried weight 2 counties over. He knew what he didn't know, which was considerably larger, and which was the part of the accounting that had always made Ezekiel uneasy about any man, regardless of what color he was or where he'd come from. It was Ottilie Prager, of all people, who gave him the piece he was missing, though she had no idea she was giving him anything at all. Ezekiel had gone into town on Thursday for wire and nails, and while Ottilie totaled his bill, she mentioned, in the idle way she mentioned most things, that Mose Gantry had finally cleared his account at the Mercantile, a debt of nearly $9 that had sat unpaid on her books since the spring, and that she'd assumed, given Mose's bad knee and thinning work, might never get settled at all. "Surprised me," Ottilie said, sliding the receipt across the counter. "Paid in full, all at once, first week of the month. Said a friend had helped him out, though he wouldn't say who." Ezekiel hadn't thought much of it standing there. It was only that evening, going over the crew's pay records at his kitchen table, that he noticed Thaddeus had drawn no wages at all for the first week of November, had, in fact, asked Amos to hold that week's pay back rather than collect it, a request Amos had honored without comment, because it wasn't his business to ask why. $9. The exact amount Mose Gantry's debt had come to. Ezekiel sat with that a long while, turning it over the way he'd turned over the conversation at the corral, and what struck him hardest was not the kindness itself, though the kindness was real enough. It was the silence around it. Thaddeus had done this quietly, weeks before the confrontation at the rail. At a time when he had every reason to be building whatever case for himself he could manage. And he had never once mentioned it. Not to Ezekiel, not to Amos, not, as far as Ezekiel could determine, to anyone at all who might have carried the story back to where it would do him some good. A man who held a card like that and never played it was a man Ezekiel had spent 30 years failing to find in his own experience, and it unsettled him considerably more than any amount of poverty ever could. He found Belle in the kitchen that night, going over the household accounts by the same lamp he usually claimed for himself, and he sat down across from her, without his ledger, which she noticed immediately, because her father did not sit at that table without his ledger. "I offered your Mr. Cole $400 to leave," Ezekiel said, "Tuesday morning, at the corral." Belle's hand went still on the page in front of her. "You didn't tell me that. I'm telling you now." He turned the tin cup slowly in his hands. He had carried it with him from the kitchen shelf all week, unable, for reasons he was only beginning to understand, to put it back where it belonged. He turned it down. "Told me he meant to court you regardless, without a dollar of mine changing hands over it. And you're only telling me now because I found out something else about him this week that I didn't ask to find out, and it's made me question 30 years of the way I've been counting things." He set the cup on the table between them. "I built this ranch so you'd never have to start with nothing the way I did. I've spent your whole life deciding, on my own, what would keep you safe, and I never once asked whether safe was the thing you most wanted from me." Belle looked at her father for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentler than the words themselves. "I never wanted you to stop protecting me, Papa. I wanted you to trust me to know what was worth protecting." Ezekiel nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders, some old and careful vigilance he had carried so long he'd forgotten it was a weight at all, eased for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. "I know that now," he said. "I've been slow getting there, but I know it now." Ezekiel found Thaddeus at the corral the following evening, working a green colt that was still learning to accept a saddle's weight without flinching, and he stood at the rail a while before he spoke, watching the particular quality of patience the younger man brought to an animal that had given him no reason yet to trust it. "I never told you why I keep that cup," Ezekiel said finally. Thaddeus kept his attention on the colt, giving Ezekiel the same courtesy he gave every skittish thing that needed room to come forward on its own time. "No, sir, you didn't. I was 17 the last night I spent on the place where I was born. There was trouble that night, a man beaten near to death for a thing he didn't do, and I saw who did it, and the overseer running that place gave me a choice. Keep quiet, and there'd be an easier road out for me when the time came. Say what I saw, and there wouldn't be any road out at all." He turned the cup over once in his hands. "I chose quiet. I was 17, and I was scared, and I told myself I'd make it right somehow. Later, when I had the standing to do it safely, I never did make it right. The man I stayed silent for died 3 winters later, still on that place, and I carried this cup out the night I finally did leave, months after I should have, as a way of never letting myself forget what silence had cost, and what it hadn't managed to buy me anyway." Thaddeus said nothing. He had the sense, correctly, that nothing needed saying yet. "I built this ranch," Ezekiel went on, "as an argument I was making to myself, every single day for 30 years, that a man could recover from choosing wrong once if he spent the rest of his life proving he'd choose right from then on. I gave you money at that rail because some old, frightened part of me still believes the only thing that keeps a person safe is what they can hold in their hand. I know better than that. I've known better than that my whole life. I just forgot it, for a while, where my daughter was concerned. He held the cup out. This was never really about testing whether you'd take the money, he said. It was about whether you'd notice the cup was there at all, sitting beside it, and wonder what it meant that I'd brought it. You noticed. You asked. That's the part I couldn't have written into any ledger, and it's the part that's mattered most, in the end. Thaddeus took the cup carefully, the way a man takes something he understands to be worth considerably more than its weight. I'll take care of it, he said. I know you will, Ezekiel said. That's the whole of what I needed to know. He left Thaddeus at the corral without another word, walking back toward the house in the last gold light of the evening, and Thaddeus stood there a while, with the old tin cup in his hand, turning it slowly, before he set it carefully in his saddlebag and went to find Belle. He found her down at the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the home pasture, where the cottonwoods had gone the color of the cup itself, worn gold and soft in the fading light, and she looked up when she heard him coming, and didn't ask why he was smiling in a way she'd never quite seen on him before. Your father gave me something today, he said, and showed her the cup. Belle went very still. He's never let that cup out of the house in my whole life. He told me why he keeps it. Thaddeus didn't repeat the story. Some things, he understood, belonged first and always to the person who'd lived them, and it wasn't his place to hand them onward before Ezekiel chose to. I think he was telling me something bigger than the cup, though. I think he was telling me he's decided to trust me with the parts of himself he's never trusted anyone with, including you. They stood together at the edge of the creek, the water running low and clear over the stones the way it did every autumn, once the season's rains had passed, and for a while, neither of them said anything at all, because some things, arriving after so many small and careful weeks of not saying, didn't need to be rushed into words the moment they finally could be. I told you once, Belle said eventually, that I'd already done my own accounting where you were concerned. You did. I meant it. I mean it more now. She looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at him that first afternoon by the corral, an acknowledgement rather than a performance. I love you, Thaddeus Cole. I've known it for weeks and been too careful to say it, because I've spent my whole life being careful about everything, the way my father taught me to be. I don't want to be careful about this. I love you too, he said, simply, the words arriving with none of the hesitation either of them might have expected after so many weeks of restraint. I think I've known it since the day you watched me settle that horse and didn't say a single word about it, and I understood, somehow, that you'd already decided everything you needed to decide. She laughed then, soft and unguarded, and reached for his hand, and he took it, and the two of them stood there together at the edge of the creek, as the light went from gold to blue around them, holding a battered tin cup between them that carried, now, considerably more than either of them could have entered into any ledger, a whole account of what a family had survived, what a father had finally learned to trust, and what a woman and a man had built together, quietly, out of nothing more than steadiness, patience, and the plain refusal to be less than exactly who they were.